Welcome, everyone. We will begin shortly. If you haven't already done so yet, please mute yourself. For those of you who are just getting into the meeting, hello, welcome. We're glad to have you here today. Please mute yourself if you haven't done so yet. We will begin shortly. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it a few more minutes. I see a lot of people coming into the meeting right now. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning. We will begin in just a minute or so. All right, well, thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. Before we get started, I wanted to go over just a few things. First of all, please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address all of the questions or comments at the end of the program. And if you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comments section. And please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live. It will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker today. Her name is Karen Helmerson, and she is a docent at the Timken. Karen will be speaking about the highlights from 4 of the world's greatest museums: the Louvre, the Metropolitan, the Prado, and the Uffizi Gallery. So thank you very much, Karen. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please put them into the comments section, either here on Zoom or on Facebook. So take it away, Karen.
Thank you so much, Christina. Christina Rosenberger is our Director of Education and does so many things at the Timken, and I was fortunate to be able to train under her. So it's always a pleasure to see her. As Christina mentioned, we do really encourage a dialogue with our audience, and we love questions. Unfortunately, it's very hard sometimes during the presentations to address questions, but sometimes I can, but preferably at the end, and we do leave a little time, so feel free. So this lecture is a little different than usual. I'm not really concentrating on one time period or genre. I really wanted to explore museums that many of you have visited. And of course, there are so many great museums throughout the world. One of my favorites is the Rijksmuseum, which I did not include. But obviously, these great repositories of art where education and the maintenance of beautiful masterpieces is paramount. And in our own way at the Timken, we are doing the exact same thing. And so kind of in honor of the Timken reopening in spring, I thought we would look at other great museums. Obviously, these are vast museums that have artwork that cover many, many centuries. So right now we are looking at a painting by the great Leonardo da Vinci, an Annunciation. But we will look at that painting a little bit farther on, and I'm just going to give you a couple comments about each museum. Because of the scope of this, covering 4 large museums, I want to get through to the Met, so I will probably give you a little bit fewer details, but we'll still see how that goes. Okay, the Uffizi Gallery. Of course, so much of this museum was determined by the Medici family. Today, if you look at the collection, it covers artwork from the 13th to the 18th century. And you know, for example, that some museums specialize in certain time periods, others are vast repositories of art over many centuries. So the Uffizi really was an office building, and it was called, Uffizi in Italian means office building. But as I said, the Medici family began using it as an office building, and then it became a repository for many of the works of art that they had collected. It existed for 250 years, I believe, before it became a museum, began in 1560 as offices. And the great Giorgio Vasari was the initial architect of this magnificent structure, but he died before its completion. So other architects took on the cause. And we have in this museum the only known painting by Michelangelo extant that is not a fresco, not a sculpture, etc. So another really wonderful thing about the Uffizi, as you look at the structure, we have Doric capitals and, Corinthian. I believe we just have Doric here, but these beautiful sculptural niches and this open courtyard. And if you know in Florence how contemporary artists will paint, and it's a great place to collect. So I'm going to move on and look at one of the most incredible masterpieces of Western art. And Maestra Madonna by Giotto is so instrumental in really becoming the first, what we would consider Renaissance painting in Western Europe. Why do we say that? Because, well, first of all, look at the date. At this time, we really begin to see Renaissance ideals emerging. What are those ideals? Well, Giotto studied with Cimabue. He was Florentine, and he was very influential in breaking away from the Byzantine style. However, you can see in this gold coloration here that it is including what was really important to the Byzantine style. We call this kind of Italo-Byzantine style. Now, Maestra for a Madonna means Madonna in majesty. And as we have talked about before, the Madonna is often pictured in many different styles. And what I mean by style is Madonna of humility, the Madonna in Sacra Conversazione, in sacred conversation, a Madonna who's on the ground, the Madonna who's uplifted. But here she is uplifted in this beautiful throne. Now, we consider this, as I said, the first painting of really early Renaissance. Why? Again, look at the ideals of three-dimensionality that he is able to create. It is no longer flat. Here we really see substance in the painting. You see actually kind of three-dimensionality on this two-dimensional picture plane. We have the saints and angels witnessing this, but they are smaller. And that, of course, indicates the stature of the Virgin Mary and, of course, the infant Jesus, who holds his fingers in benediction. And then, of course, we see these intricate patterns here all through the throne. And then the angels hold a white lily. And white lily, of course, is the purity of the Virgin. And we have a very light halo and a more definite halo around the baby Jesus. And I think I would like to say just that we begin to see a little bit of use of lighting that becomes so important. And lastly, they call it the Onnisante Madonna because it was for the Onnisante Church and it was commissioned by the Humiliati. So we will go on to the next image. Now, this is a very complicated painting, Gentile de Fabriano, the Adoration of the Magi, was done again in the early Renaissance. This is before the advent of the printing press. And the reason why I bring up the printing press when we look at this is because Gentile de Fabriano adopted what is called the International Gothic style. The International Gothic style emerged from the Burgundian court, and through marriage, the Netherlandish region was connected to this court. Now, books, which were called illuminated manuscripts, were handmade, as you know, beautifully decorated by famous artists, and they passed through different regions of France, Netherlandish region, and into Italy. And that is where someone like de Fabriano would have seen them. Now, this is a very complicated work of art. Why is it complicated? Well, you have this ornate frame with these tondos. What are the tondos? Tondo is round, and you'll see that with our Michelangelo, the Doni Tondo, but you see the Annunciation, the benediction of Christ, and Mary receiving the Assumption. Now, we also have seen the predella is almost like a shelf that comes out of an altarpiece. And we see, escape from, the flight into Egypt and different various stories from the Bible. So that is here at the base. What do we have here? It's so ornate. Again, that international Gothic style that was very popular among the aristocratic and royal set, particularly the Burgundian court. So we have these kings dressed as elaborate Italian aristocrats. Look at the costuming. I mean, it's magnificent. The benefactors of this piece were the Strozzi family, contemporaries and kind of not in competition always, but with the Medici family. So we can see, I beg your pardon, I'll go back. The donor, the main donor, the father Strozzi, is here and right here. And then his son is behind him, and he has a falcon, a bird, and it indicates the idea of falconeering among the aristocracy. We also see everything from the flight into Egypt to the travels of the Magi, of course, the adoration. And then we have the Virgin Mary and Joseph and the Christ child. And then we have the aristocrats looking on. What is also really amazing about this piece is that you actually see really exotic animals. There's a dromedary, and this creature, I'm not even sure. There's a big cat somewhere, these beautiful horses. So this represents the height of the international Gothic style. And we would consider it, yes, of course, Renaissance, but bringing in that Gothic style. And another thing I do want to point out is when you see these three arches, it represents the Holy Trinity. Now, we're going to go on to this magnificent Annunciation by Leonardo da Vinci. And he studied with Verrocchio, and he did have influence by Ghirlandaio. But look at this early date. If you think about the Mona Lisa was done approximately 30 years after this. So this is his earliest extant painting that we know of. And this Annunciation is really unusual. Some people would say, with a knowledge of religious studies, for example, that it is a little unusual, the exact depiction. But we're not going to dwell on that so much. We're just going to dwell on the beauty and the aspects of the painting. So we have the angel Gabriel holding his fingers in benediction as he approaches the Virgin Mary to let her know that she will receive the Christ child. What's very remarkable is look at the coloration. It's kind of dark, and it's very, there's a lot of light. Look at the use of chiaroscuro, even though we know of chiaroscuro so much with the Baroque, and we look at Caravaggio, but of course, Leonardo and some of the Northern Renaissance artists were experimenting with light. He used what is called sfumato, smoke, and you can see it around her hairline. But take a look at how realistic these wings are. What's interesting about Leonardo is, he made many studies of scientific things, of the human body, of machinery. He developed cannons and all kinds of things, but he loved nature. And when he first did these wings, if you looked to this point, they were actually bird wings. But another artist, and we are not sure who, someone close to him, extended the wings to make it more of an angel. Now, look at the Virgin Mary. She stands in front of this beautiful sarcophagus looking table, and the table with a lot of bas relief, that's sculptural relief that comes out of a solid surface and isn't freestanding, bas, B-A-S, you probably all know that, with the seashells. This is actually reminiscent of a Medici sarcophagus. So it is said that this represents a sarcophagus. Now, Gabriel holds the white lily, and that is the purity of the Virgin. We also have a field of flowers, again, the purity of the Virgin Mary and his interest in nature. Remember, Leonardo was one of the first artists to bring in landscape into portraiture and religious paintings. So this is a magnificent landscape. Look at his understanding of perspective. It's absolutely brilliant at this early stage. The ability to show a landscape that recedes into the background, but yet we have these very full-bodied figures against an architectural wall. I will go on, and I do want to show you probably what is considered one of the most beautiful paintings in all of Western art, and that is Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. This painting was said to be one of the first times we have an artwork on linen, tempera on linen. And now linen was used sporadically as early as the 14th century. However, it really wasn't until the 16th century with the Venetian Renaissance painters, who we're going to look at in just a second, that we really begin to see more use of linen or canvas as opposed to wood panel. So that's pretty remarkable. Second, of course, this was commissioned by a Medici family, and it represents works of art that were non-religious. This subject matter is Ovid's Metamorphosis. And so, of course, it's more based on mythological concepts, and we do not have a religious topic here. So that's pretty interesting, because it was in the Renaissance, in the late Renaissance, we begin to move away from the family portraits of the aristocracy or religious paintings. We begin to see more of mythology. So again, Ovid's was the genesis of this painting. What do we have here? So Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite in Greek, and Venus in Rome. She is birthed on the sea, and she stands on an open shell. And the Zephyr, the god of the west wind, blows her onto shore. And you see the wind is very full of movement because the wind and the drapes are very pronounced. Then you see Aura, one of the goddess's assistants, and she wants to cover and help with her very modest goddess. You can see that her exquisite hair covers her here, and then this flower adorned cloak is meant to be wrapped around the goddess. And then, of course, you have this lovely forest, and she seems to almost be in movement. And she too has a lot of these patterns of flowers. And what does that represent? Well, it looks like violets, and violets were known for a couple things: purity, not so much purity, but kind of romantic purity, and also love potions. So it's filled with flowers, reference to Greek mythology, and we celebrate this beautiful woman. He used white glazing and powder to make the colors really shine. And if you had the pleasure of seeing this in the Uffizi, I'm sure you spent a lot of time looking at every aspect of this painting. Now, I'm going to go back and go forward again. So now we have what's called the Donitondo, and this is by our very own Michelangelo. So we all know that Michelangelo, in the High Renaissance, I did a talk last week, he was working in Rome here, and his great rival was Raphael. They were like always in rivalry, but that's immaterial. It's just that this is probably the most well-known painting by Leonardo that is on tempera on panel, that is in a museum, as opposed to a fresco, a sculpture, etc. So this is very unique. It's called the Donitondo because the Doni family were the benefactors to this tondo, and of course, as I mentioned, it's circular. What's amazing about this painting is its reference to Hellenistic sculpture. And I am going to kind of break from just depicting and talking about paintings when we go to the Louvre, because I want you to see the Nike of Samothrace. It's one of the most magnificent works of art I have ever seen. But why am I talking about that? Well, there's a reference to Hellenistic sculpture in this vibrant painting. It was known to Michelangelo, the Laocoon, a brilliant Hellenistic work of art. And so he was beginning, because, in Rome, they have access to all this Greco-Roman sculpture. So it begins, in the Renaissance, They are looking at ideals of sculpture, humanism, mathematics, advancements in thinking, and of course, looking back at antiquity was very important to these Renaissance artists, as we just saw with Botticelli. Now, the tondo represents the Holy Family, but look at how their forms are twisted, almost as a sculpture. And the baby Jesus is quite sculptural, quite remarkably sculptural. And then we have sort of a low wall. It's not a balustrade, it's kind of not ornate, but we have John, the infant John here, his cousin, looking on. And then we see remnants of landscape. But we have figures who represent sort of the pagan world. So the pagan world looks on as we see the Holy Family. But his use of color, remember that the ubiquitous red and blue for the Virgin Mary, and this exquisitely sculptured Jesus who's turned almost like his body is very curvilinear. And then of course, Joseph holds him, with arms. It's kind of hard to see the hands that hold the baby. But again, look at this three-dimensionality. It is very typical of his interest and work in sculpture. Now, Caravaggio, we are going, and I'm trying to do a little bit of a sequential, chronological. So here we are going toward the beginning of the Italian Baroque. But Caravaggio was so important because as we talk about his use of light was so chiaroscuro, was so profound with him that we kind of identify chiaroscuro with Caravaggio, even though, of course, it existed much earlier, as we talked about. But let me talk to you a little bit about this. This is Bacchus, or Dionysus, the god of theater, of wine, of fertility, and partying. And he was considered the god who could be a really great and wonderful god if you got along with him. But then they said he was very kind of mischievous and maybe even a little evil when you did not. So Caravaggio unfortunately died young. He was a very controversial figure. And this painting represents, some ideas about him. Some people say this Bacchus, god of wine, was a representation of Caravaggio himself, painted when he was about 24. Others say that it was his lover, and he was known to have his male lovers, and it was really accepted at that time, and especially among the aristocracy. And in fact, probably the patron who commissioned this was also very supportive of this relationship that Caravaggio had with his young model. So it was either Caravaggio's lover or Caravaggio himself. Now, he kind of holds a ribbon at his waist, and he proffers a goblet of wine, a tasso of wine. And that's sort of come and join me to the viewer. And then, of course, this beautiful glass orb of wine. But there was also a bit of reminiscing about decay and let's say, being careful of our passions, because we have a rotting fruit and we have pomegranates. So opening up sort of sensuality, very unusual plate of fruit, very dark and kind of ominous. And then we have, of course, this exquisite chiaroscuro, this very plain background, but yet a very ornate headdress. And of course, this kind of muscular, but yet soft body. So this is obviously related to mythology and has no religious, really, except for the idea of memento mori, mementos of meaning, like decaying fruit, that sort of thing. So I sometimes have to go kind of back and forth, but I wanted to show you a Netherlandish piece. This is one of the most important triptychs ever created in the Northern Renaissance. So the Portinari, why do we have Hugo van der Goes was one of the greatest Netherlandish painters, painting for this Italian family. Well, I'll explain that the Portinari family were very important bankers for the Medicis. And as you know, one of the ways the Medici made so much money in the Renaissance and later was because they were banking family. And so the Portinari, Italian, connected to the Medici court, worked in Ghent and also Bruges. And Hugo van der Goes comes from that area, which would be today part of Belgium. And so he created this altarpiece because, of course, there's a lot of cross-pollination between Northern Renaissance and Italian Renaissance. Think about Albrecht Dürer, who we'll talk about. He moved into, stayed in Italy for a while, and he brought a lot of the Netherlandish and German Renaissance pieces. So there was a lot of back and forth also with the manuscripts. And so that is why we have an Italian donor with a Netherlandish artist. So this is such a remarkable triptych, 3-panel piece. So we have the infant Jesus lying on the ground. That's kind of unusual. He's not in some kind of container or a cradle. It's right on the ground, but then of course there's a spiritual light that surrounds him. And we have in the front these little still lifes. Remember the evolution of still life painting that comes so prominently from the Netherlandish region. So we have white lilies, that is the purity of the Virgin. We have the wheat of the Eucharist. We have red lilies that represent the passion of Christ. And then we have irises. And irises, as you know, have a very kind of spiky leaf, and that represents Mary's 7 hardships. Now, what is so remarkable to me in this painting is if you look at these peasant figures, it's really unusual to see their kind of rustic faces. You never see that. We have not really seen that in art before this time. Usually if you're mentioning the religious or the aristocracy, they're going to be of that sort of class. But these are peasants really close in and very realistic. And then of course you have this amazing architectural elements and even remnants of landscape. Now, these are the donors. And Hugo van der Goes makes the donors much smaller because he elevates the position of the saints here and of course the Holy Family. So the donors, saints were representing here. And let me just say that it kind of escapes me at the moment. We have Saint Anthony with the bell and Saint Thomas with a spear. And then if we go over here, we have Saint Margaret with she's holding there's a dragon here and she's holding a book. And then we have Mary Magdalene who carries a jar of ointment. So that's to the right. And then of course we have this magnificent landscape. So they all kneel in awe of this Christ child and his birth. And everybody's in these really ornate costumes. And again, this exquisite use of light, because, you know, in the Renaissance, this is where we begin to see how important light is. And then look at this magnificent landscape. So we'll move on because I could talk about this painting for probably another 20 minutes, and we hold it. We're ready to go. I just want to double check that. Yes. Okay. So we're ready to go to the Prado in Spain. And the Prado Museum, of course, it represents artwork from about I believe it's the 12th century to about the 18th century. And because of the Habsburg rule in that region, in the Netherlandish region, before about 1609, when it was Holland and Belgium separated, Holland became Protestant, but we still have the Catholic religion predominant in obviously Spain, throughout parts of Europe, and definitely in the region which would be today Belgium. And I bring that up because you're going to look at some of the paintings that relate to that idea. So a couple things about the Prado. It became a museum in 1819. It begins with, I believe, said the 12th century. Lots and lots of the artwork come from the Spanish royal families, the Habsburg in particular. The architect was a man named Villanueva. He started it in 1785. And then, of course, we have the aristocracy from Spain and their collection. I'm going to go on. Probably, I could look, talk, think about this Descent from the Cross for such a long period of time. It's a very complicated painting. It's remarkable in its beauty. And what we see with Roger van der Weyden's great artwork is a true monument to grief and suffering. And this was a central panel for a triptych. And as you know, the triptychs could close and there's outside artwork. We don't have, they are no longer around. So we will look at this amazing central panel. Now, if you look at this tracery here, you see a rather unusual, what looks like a crossbow. Why is that? Well, it's because the guild that made crossbows, I know that sounds kind of complicated, they commissioned this altarpiece. And so that's why we have remnants of a crossbow here. Second of all, look at the very unusual cross-like configuration of this central panel, very unusual. And another remarkable feature is the very crowding of the picture plane. They are not out in the open areas. If you would think about the Descent of the Cross, they are in an enclosed environment, almost like a golden sarcophagus. Now, Roger van der Weyden was one of the most important Netherlandish artists, very important, along with Jan van Eyck, and we have a Paetus Christus. So he descends from that great lineage. And what do we have here? So we have the dead Christ, and he's in this S curve, and he's being held by Joseph and Nicodemus. They hold him and they carry him down. Look out how his body is in this S curve, and you see the stigmata here. His hand is limp and there's blood oozing from his stigmata here. Look at how Mary, who's been fallen in abject grief, mirrors the curvature of the body of her son. Then we have St. John, holding her, and her sister, half-sister Mary of Cleopas, with tears dripping down her face. We have another Mary, I believe that's Mary Salome. We have Mary Magdalene here. And look out how the Mary and St. John mirror, they're kind of like heraldic figures as the body descends. So these two gentlemen were responsible for bearing Christ. We have an unnamed individual here with the jar of lotion. And then we have a young man who is unnamed, and he helps Jesus as he descends. And you can see that he has nails in his hand, sort of gruesome. And look at the ornate cloth. Look at the skull of Adam, Golgotha, I always mispronounce it, sorry, where Jesus was martyred, and then the skull of Adam. So again, look at this rich robes, the coloration, the chiaroscuro as it falls on this magnificent work of art. Now, this painting, I could talk again for hours on this painting, but of course I always run out of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but I will say that Hieronymus Bosch, a great Northern Renaissance painter, Netherlandish, has been talked about for generations because this painting is not 100% fully understood. We do have a triptych, and on the outside we have Grisaille, this gray drawing of a God creating the earth. And then we have what's here is the left panel that is supposed to continue into the central panel. And then of course you see the skyline is totally different. So the right represents hell. This is Adam and Eve in the garden, and this is man on earth. So here we have Adam and Eve, God and Adam and Eve, and Adam, as it's said by some art historians, looks a little bit with kind of lust at Eve. And some people would say, and I'm sorry if it offends anybody, but some people would say that this triptych represents kind of misogynistic ideas, in that women brings the downfall of man and sensuality. Because if you really look at Adam here, he does kind of look very fondly at Eve. We have a fanciful landscape, and some people again would say this is surreal. Well, surrealism doesn't occur until the 20th century. So using the term surreal is a little bit of a misnomer. We can say it does appear surreal to us in the 21st century, but was his intent a dreamlike state? Because surrealism comes from psychic automatism, what the ideas of dreams that come from our mind. So was that the intent? Not so much, we're not sure. And these lustful interpretations of man's misbehavior, was he that type, Hieronymus Bosch? Absolutely not. He was a very, very serious and devout Christian. And so he's making more of a commentary as opposed to gleefully engaging with this. But you see men and women in all kinds of romantic and sensual postures. You see all this nudity. You see these what are called biomorphic forms that look almost like spaceships. Very unusual. And then we go into hell. Again, for brevity, I have to continue. Look at these weird figures. Like we have a nun that has a porcine face. That means a pig face. We have a musician reading off a human body, works, notes, musical score. We have musical instruments. We have all kinds of mischievous, here is ears and a sword. It's quite awful. And then, you know, hell and damnation, the plague. And I hope one day when you go to the Timken, when we reopen in spring, you will look at our own Savaldo, because our own Savaldo was greatly inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. And you can even see quotations in his representation of hell directly from this Prado masterpiece. Now, Adam and Eve by Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer, as you might remember, is one of the geniuses of the Northern Renaissance. He came from Germany. He traveled quite a bit in Italy. This was done after his second trip to Italy, and he grasped a lot of the concepts that were evolving in the Italian Renaissance and brought to Italy some of the developments in Northern Renaissance. He was an engraver. He was a bookmaker, a maker of books. And even though, you know, the printing press was developed in 1440, and then of course, we saw many books produced in 1450, he still made handmade books and also books that were printed. So he's very interested in bookmaking. And he goes to Italy and he studies the definite beauty of the human body. And so it's a combination of the Northern Renaissance along with Italian ideals. Of course, look at the light. We have this development of light that occurs in both those regions. We have the modesty of the two figures, and then we have the snake ready to grasp, is kind of holding onto the apple. And these are very kind of Italianate figures as the light falls, and then this wonderful tree. So we are combining here Albrecht Dürer's interest in nature, because remember he did all those beautiful sketches of nature and drawings, blade of grass, the hair, but also his understanding of the human body. Lastly, I just want to point out that remember Italy is a much warmer climate than the North. And so the Italian Renaissance artists were much more apt to show nudity. Also, it's because of their heritage from ancient Roman Greece, looking at sculpture. It wasn't so pronounced in the North. So that is kind of an interesting aspect of this painting. Okay, Raphael, portrait of a cardinal. Raphael and Michelangelo were rivals. And they were kind of, what do we call them, frenemies? They were kind of frenemies. They were really competing with each other. Raphael was a genius, as was Michelangelo and Leonardo and many of these artists, but he was really a genius. He was a prodigy. And he did not live a long life. He died of, we'll say, consumption. And but he did paint these cardinals. We don't know for sure. There's many ideas about who this could be as a cardinal, and I'm not going to spend time naming everybody. So it was a young cardinal, disputed who it was. And what's a very fascinating concept to me is this idea of what's called pintamento. Pintamento is painting that occurred under a work of art, but it's since been painted over. And you must know this and you might know this, and the scrim is still visible. So if you look very closely, he had longer hair. There's a scrim of the hair, but Raphael decides to cut it. The other thing, the left eye was lowered, sort of changed. So there is pintamento underneath this painting. So again, Raphael wanted to show just this mastery of portraiture. Think about how exquisite his Madonnas were. And, we talked about that in talking about the High Renaissance last week. Look at the marbling in the cardinal's robes. If you look at how the arm is kind of leaning over, he is inspired by the Mona Lisa, because of course he knew Leonardo. We also have this very dark background and the use of chiaroscuro. Now, if the light was even more intense, we'd say tenebrism, which is more popular among the Spanish Baroque painters. I have to let you know that my computer kind of glitches, so I will try to not have it. I'm just going to really quickly talk about this, the Three Graces. This is by Peter Paul Rubens, and it is Baroque. So it is a Baroque painting of the Three Graces. And what do the Three Graces represent? Okay, they're mythological, and they represent goodness in the world, friendliness, good humor, kindness. And it was said that without the Three Graces, we wouldn't have goodness in the world. So that was, a myth. And look at these very fleshy women. And these were women, as you know, who represent the style of what was considered beautiful in the Baroque. Now, Peter Paul Rubens was one of the most important Flemish artists, because you see the date 1630. This was done after the bifurcation of Holland and Belgium. He retained his Catholic religion, as did what is today Belgium. He worked for many of the courts of Europe. He traveled through Europe. He was said he was a spy. He worked for the Habsburgs and the Medicis. He also maintained one of the most impressive studios in all of Europe. Now, again, we're going to talk about these women just really quickly. You see the use of a lot of primary color here. Almost all of the painting is using red, blue, and yellow. The flesh tones, a lot of yellow. Look at that magnificent cerulean blue. And of course, his interest in nature. And he's quoting still life painting that were so popular among the Netherlandish, at this point, the Flemish painters, and of course in Holland. And then we have the little Pootie who sits atop this water spout. And we have the two Graces facing each other, and one turns her back to us. And, it's very sensual. Of course, he wants to promote beauty, sensuality, kindness. And then we have this diaphanous drape that really does not cover very much. And then, of course, a landscape. Now, one of the greatest works by any Spanish painter is Las Meninas. And this is a very complex painting by Diego Velázquez. Diego Velázquez was a Baroque painter, and we have so many important Baroque painters that emerged from Spain, and we have them represented in the Timken, Murillo, Zurbarán, and later Goya. And so Velázquez was probably the pinnacle of greatness in Spanish painting. So Las Meninas is fact and fiction. Well, what do I mean by that? Fact. This is the studio in the palace, the Alcazar Palace of the great Diego Velázquez. We have him right here. He's painting what? What is he painting? Is he painting the portrait of the Habsburg monarchs, Philip IV, who is the father of the little, queen in waiting, the little princess? And the Meninas were her ladies in waiting. We have one of the Meninas offering her a little cup of water. We have sort of the like the butler to the family. We have the dwarfs, who one is actually kicking the dog. We have two paintings by Rubens. Well, why is that? Well, Rubens was highly collected in the Habsburg court. And so Velázquez, who wants to elevate his statue, hey, look, and I'm also an art collector, just like the royal family. And then we have this use of a mirror. Where does that come from? That is probably from the Arnolfini portrait by the great Jan van Eyck. So look how he understands how cool colors and dark colors are so dramatic. And he uses a kind of a, it's not exactly, well, could be vermilion as a sort of a lower red, and then the light, this dark, and this tenebrism, this light against darkness. So this is commenting about the life of Velázquez, the elevation of the court, that he was a member of the court, and that he's playing kind of a trick on us. Lastly, I do want to say that this tragedy did befall the little princess. She died at 22. She was empress to the Holy Roman Empire, but did not live very long. Okay, last from the Prado, and I don't know if we'll get to the Met, but we will quickly get to the Louvre for 10 minutes, sorry. Saturn devouring his children, gruesome image. For Francisco Goya, who worked for the royal family in the 19th century and late 18th century, was paranoid and he was going deaf. And so he had a lot of insecurities, and he began painting these black paintings. He called them black paintings. And this was actually painted in his own farmhouse studio. And it was a happy painting. And as he became more and more paranoid and more horrified by war and revolution, this was done about 20 years after the French Revolution, and knowing what's happening in Spain with the Inquisition, he shows Spain, Saturn, devouring his own child. This is a maniacal, crazy psychopath eating his own child. Remember, Saturn was kind of all the gods sort of descended from him in terms of Neptune came, was a prodigy of him, Zeus, Pluto, etc. And what's so sickening about this is the blood, the gruesomeness, but also this is not a male figure. This is actually not even a child. It's sort of a fully developed woman. So we'll move on from this and we'll go to the Louvre and look at the magnificence of the Louvre. It's the biggest museum in the world. 66% of it is French. And then, of course, we have this IMP pyramid that was built in 1989 to expand the facilities. But because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to continue. When I first visited the Louvre as a college student, I was just mesmerized by this amazing work of Hellenistic art. It was on the landing. It looks like it's about to take flight. And what is really important about this sculpture is that a lot of Hellenistic art does not exist. Pergamon, the altar of Pergamon, for example, the Laocoon, but a lot of them are Roman copies. So this is one of the few Hellenistic works of art, the latter stage of the Greek Empire, that we have. Now, it's meant to be looked at really kind of from the side. The left side is the most magnificent, most detailed, but we have Nike, winged Vitry. So she represents Nike of Samothrace, the island of Samothrace where she was found. The Nike celebrates a victory, but we also have Athena Parthenaeus, who was the goddess of the city of Athens and war. And so in this sculpture, they kind of combine the two Athenas, the goddess here. And so we have no head, no feet, and that is because in antiquity, the most fragile parts of a sculpture were always the joints, the elbow, the neck, and even the feet. Now they think they found her hand on the island of Samothrace, but we're not 100% sure. She was found as a fallen figure from this repository on Samothrace, and they put her together. Look at these wings, just like a bird. She's landed on the prow of a ship, and all this sort of wet drapery just fools. This sculpture has of the ship, not as refined, but the folds of the drapery, her abdomen, the wings, unbelievable. But I do have to move on. And one of my favorite paintings, and I talked about this before, is Jan van Eyck's The Madonna of Chancellor Roland. So this represents one of the greatest artists who ever lived, Jan van Eyck, who was known, he did not invent oil painting, but he did promote its development. He was also experimenting with light and three-dimensionality. And when you go back to the Timken, please go visit The Death of the Virgin, because it was by Petrus Christus, a successor of Jan van Eyck, who he studied. Now, Chancellor Roland, Chancellor of the Burgundian court. Remember, I told you there's a lot of pollination, cross-pollination between the Netherlandish region and France. He was an extremely rich man, so much so that he can commission one of the greatest artists of that time to paint this masterpiece for him. Where did he make his money? Well, he had vast lands. And why I mentioned that is because these are vineyards. And he had all these vineyards. And it used to say that there was a little bag of money to indicate his status and wealth. But I think it was taken out because it was a little too pretentious. Now, we have a loggia, an open courtyard, and we have these three arches with these Corinthian capitals. The Corinthian capitals emerged from the Hellenistic period. And I just mentioned that because we just looked at a Hellenistic sculpture. What do these three arches tell us? It is a subtle reminder of the Holy Trinity, three arches. So we have Mary. She looks at her child. He holds his fingers in benediction and holds an orb. And an angel with rainbow wings crowns her queen. And then we have the chancellor. Now, what's interesting is this is the heavenly world, and this is the world of, the world of earth. And it is separated by a line of demarcation. He doesn't really look at her, does he? He looks away because he knows of her importance. He holds a prayer book and he prays, and we can see Jan van Eyck's ability to use color, to use light, landscape, because here we have what is said to be Jerusalem, and then here we have earthly landscape with vineyards. I'm going to move on though, because I only have 5 more minutes, and I do want to get to a couple more paintings. Paolo Veronese's The Wedding at Cana. Wow, 130 figures. This is considered a late Renaissance, early Mannerist masterpiece. Who was Veronese? Well, Veronese, as I just said, was a late Renaissance, early Mannerist painter, and he was Venetian. He descends from this long line of Venetian painters who begin with the Bellini family and then go on to Giorgione and Titian, Tintoretto. And we actually, why I'm mentioning all these is because we have these artists here. I believe this is Titian, and here we actually have Veronese himself with the Viola da Gamba. And we have Jesus. Now, Jesus is with Mary and his disciples, and Jesus is the only one who looks at the audience. Here we have a balustrade, and the balustrade represents the aristocracy preparing for a wedding, but we have important figures from the Bible. We have important figures from that time period. We have the royal couple here. They're at the wedding banquet, and we have all manner of important Venetian society. We have a mixing of the exotic from the East. We have men in turbans, and we have exotic animals, a parrot with a dwarf. We have greyhounds. We have the discussion of the miracle. Why is it called the miracle of Cana? Because a wedding takes place among these aristocrats, but Jesus begins one of his first miracles and to turn water into wine. And we actually see the attendants pouring the wine into or the water into these urns. And we see, I don't know if I mentioned this is butchering of a pig. Yikes. Okay, that relates to the Passion. And then we have this exquisite blue. He actually used lapis. The one thing that the Venetians did more so than any other Renaissance artist, they loved color over form. And then we have, of course, these Corinthian capitals and Doric capitals and an amazing building. So 130 figures in this religious and also sort of a genre painting. Now, we all love Vermeer, and I'll just mention this as last because I do see our very own Christina here ready to see if we have questions. And just quickly, the Lace Maker is the smallest, most abstract painting by Johannes Vermeer, who everybody loves. And you can see his brilliance because what he did is he used abstraction to create depth. He also uses a very blank canvas. He does not embellish. That helps to kind of solidify our focus. And you can see how intricate he's able to show her putting the pins in the lace. Lastly, as I mentioned, it's his most abstract painting. And he probably used a camera obscura, which is a projection device in his painting. So I'm going to end here. And I think at another time, we did 3 museums, and I think we'll have to do the Met another time. But thank you all. And I think Christina will address our questions and discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen, for this wonderful overview. It was really wonderful to see all these beautiful paintings, all of these masterworks, and it was really delightful. I see that we have one comment on Facebook. AB says, loving all these beautiful paintings, rich colors, textures, and techniques. And I agree, it was really nice to see these beautiful works of art. And then we have one question from Facebook. Somebody said, the color of the dress of the infant Jesus is seen in many of the Middle Age paintings. It must have some symbolic meaning, but I haven't yet found it. Do you have some thoughts on that, Karen?
I don't, and I don't know if our very own Dee Dee is present because we have a resident expert among our docents on religious subject matter, and if she's there, please feel free. But, you know, we know, that was a great question, by the way, but we know that it's ubiquitous to see Mary, of course, you know, the red and blue, but the passion and spirituality. So it must have some connection to his spiritual realm. But Christina, you're an artist.
I agree, Karen. I think, and I don't know what particular painting the viewer was referring to, but of course, whenever we see gold, it symbolizes the divine. Red is the color of the passion, and blue, of course, is always the color of heaven and the heavenly realm. So I don't know exactly which painting the viewer was referring to, but I think it's safe to say that gold, blue, and red have those meanings. Don't you agree, Karen?
I would totally agree. I think that's a good summation of the idea, but a very good question, as I said.
Yeah, I see another comment on Facebook. That was a wonderful presentation. Thanks for sharing those marvelous paintings and snippets of historic background with us. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. We hope that you enjoyed this talk. Thank you also to our Facebook viewers. We had a lot of viewers on Facebook today, 150 people from all over the world. So if you like what you saw today, and if you enjoyed this presentation, please tune in again another time. You can find all of those virtual presentations on our website. When you go to events, you can see a list of upcoming talks. Karen will be giving a talk again in April. And so if you like what you saw, please tune in again another time. And thank you so much to Karen for another wonderful presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you all for joining us. And I'll see you again very soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.